The man most of the top players go to with their tip problems is Lawrie Annandale. The former referee, now a tournament director for the WSA, is always on hand to offer help to any player in need, and he explains now how to mend this vital piece of equipment.
Basically what I would do first, I would take the old tip off and I would get a blade, a Stanley blade. I've got to emphasise any kid or children that wants to do this got to be very, very careful. In fact, I would advise not to do it, get an adult to do it. You've got to be very careful, very, very sharp. Basically, once I've taken the tip off, I would put the blade on top and just slightly turn the cue. You're not taking nothing off the metal, all you're doing is taking all the rubbish, all the old glue, all the old bits of leather until it's perfectly flat, and I usually just test it with the blade to see that it is nice and flat. Then I would prepare the tip, find a nice flat piece of wood, put the tip on it and just rotate it until all the blue is gone. And I find that when you're doing this, if you just look at the base of the tip, and as long as there are no hairs, normally it's quite a good tip. If it's just coming off in a powder fashion, it seems to be quite a good tip. Once I've did that, I would then try it on the cue first for size, make sure, hold up to the light, make sure there's no gaps. Then, before I put any glue on, again using a flat piece of wood, I put the tip back on it and rub it quite hard until you burnish the underside of the tip. Now this is very useful if you're using super glue. This will tend to close up the pores so that the super glue doesn't seep into the leather. Because what you'll find is that after you've played with it for a few weeks and the tip starts to wear down and it suddenly goes very hard, it's actually the super glue that's actually seeped into the leather that you're now hitting the ball with. And this helps just to keep the glue on the surface. Then I would ask the player what type of glue he uses. A lot of players, if they need the tip done very quickly, you would have to use super glue. Especially if it comes off during a match, you only have 15 minutes, so it's got to be done very quickly. But my own preference is an impact adhesive. And with this, I put a coating on the cue, on the tip, and I'll leave for a minimum half an hour. Make sure it's perfectly dry on both sides, and then position it on and press the tip on, and that would be it. There's no way that would come off. On the other hand, if you're using super glue, I prefer to use the gel, because that way you have a couple of seconds before it actually sets hard, because it's very difficult sometimes when you have a tip that's exactly the same size to try and position it on. Eventually when it sticks, you sometimes find it's a little bit squint and then you've got to take it off again. So basically I would get the gel on, make sure it's completely covered. You don't want any air pockets or bubbles. And again, using the super glue gel, you have a little bit of time. I can then just position it on and then into the light, just move it about until I think I've got it dead central. Once I'm sure that it's going to be dead central, I'll just hold it down, making sure it doesn't move. And that's it. Then I would get a piece of tissue, just make sure all the excess glue is taken off. Just make sure again you don't get it in your fingers. Then, again, depending on the player, I would shape that depending on what kind of shape he likes. Some just like a straight dome, flat, straight up on the sides. Tony Drago, Jimmy White. But players like John Higgins, Stephen Hendry, Ken Doherty, they like a little bit of a inverted cone. So how I would do that, again, I would go back to the blade and just putting the blade at the bottom side of the tip, just gently take little slivers off it. If you keep the blade at an angle, you'll eventually get the desired shape. Depending on the angle, depends on the shape of the tip. Once that's done, what I like to use for shaping the tip is, you can buy these out of any chemist, it's just fingerboards. The reason for that is if you use ordinary sandpaper and start to do this, the chances are you're going to slip and hit the wood. And the last thing you want to do is put any marks on the wood or take any of the size away. You know, to give an example, Stephen Henry in his early days actually wore a groove underneath the ferrule, and I had to chop off an inch and put an inch on the bottom because it had weakened the cue at the top. So I like to use these. They're fairly firm, so when there is no way now that I'm going to hit the wood. If you use rough sandpaper, all you do is break up the fibres, and sometimes the tip will just spring, and once that happens, it's just absolutely no use. So I just take this, take my time. After all, these players are playing for thousands and thousands of pounds, so it's worthwhile taking the effort and get a good shape. And once I've shaped it to what I think the player likes, round the sides, what I normally do is I would have a piece of fax paper, believe it or not, and just grip it. Just imagine this is fax paper, like this, and just keep turning and turning and turning. And what the fax paper does, better than the normal paper, is it gives it a sort of burnish around the side, and it helps to keep the fibres in. So anytime, if you have a cue and you've played with it 2 or 3 days and it starts to get a little bit hairy or the fibres coming out, just use the fax paper, keep turning it around, and eventually it'll go back in and it'll burnish it up. If you do that every day, the tip will last a lot longer. Now, once a player has got a new tip, what I advise them to do is to go and play at least 2 or 3 hours with the tip. The tip will then start to bed itself in, squash down, and it'll start to go out of shape a little bit. Then he brings it back. I'll reshape it again with the blade and the fingerboard. And in any amount of times that he comes back and forward, especially at a tournament, especially with a new tip, I'll reshape it until it's formed. It doesn't move again. All that will happen then is it'll just wear down. But it'll wear down pretty even. And basically, if you follow that method, you can't really go too wrong.